Imagine you're back in time in the 1930s and 40s, and just outside of the old YMCA at 180 West 135th Street, you see something interesting. You see an Italian and a black man sitting down in the open and playing chess together. It is indeed interesting. After all, segregation would not be ended until 1964, decades later. But these two men, dear friends, these two men are not regular people. You'd be looking at Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the father of modern organized crime in the United States, and Ellsworth Raymond "Bumpy" Johnson, the first black mafia boss. How this unique imagery came to be set before you on 135th Street in Harlem, New York, is one of the most unlikely stories. So today I'll tell you all about the life of the coolest black gangster Bumpy Johnson and how he rose to the top of the crime underworld. Ellsworth Raymond "Bumpy" Johnson. Not too many people take on the Mafia and emerge unscathed, let alone win, but Ellsworth Raymond "Bumpy" Johnson managed to do both. Born on the 31st of October 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy Johnson is regarded as one of the toughest gangsters of the 20th century. Johnson was a man of many monikers, perhaps even more than he could count. Some describe him as the Golden Age Cat with 9 lives. Others call him the Harlem Godfather. Even his most referenced name, Bumpy, was a moniker given to him due to the abnormal growth at the back of his head. But regardless of whatever you choose to call him, one thing was clear. Bumpy Johnson was not a nice guy, and no matter what he did, trouble always seemed to find him. Johnson's first encounter with trouble came at the age of 10. His older brother Willie had been accused of killing a white man, and despite the fact that he had no direct contribution to the crime, Bumpy Johnson and his other siblings ultimately became potential targets of reprisal attacks from the family of the victim. As a result, their parents, Margaret Moultrie and William Johnson, relocated the family to Harlem in Manhattan, New York. Located around 250 miles away from Charleston, Harlem was a supposed haven for black families in the early 20th century. But of course, the environment and lifestyle of this new environment was very much different to what Johnson and his siblings were used to in Charleston. Critically, the arrival of the Johnsons coincided with the Harlem Renaissance, an iconic era between 1918 and 1937, when the intellectual and cultural movement of African American arts, literature, theater, and politics was vibrant in Harlem. As expected, this development led to the mass migrations of African Americans from everywhere within the United States into Harlem. Black exiles, Negroes, and expatriates from the Caribbean and Africa also relocated to the neighborhood in their numbers. This created a multi-ethnic environment with diverse social influences. For a child looking to build the foundation of his character and personality, it must have been difficult for Johnson to ignore the bad influences he was exposed to. Right from his days in Charleston, Johnson was known to have a short fuse and a well-documented resentment towards white people. While speaking to reporters, the crime boss admits he had daily running battles with hostile white kids in order to attend school or venture into the streets. Understandably, his parents feared for his safety. They feared that his inability to be subservient would eventually get him lynched someday, and that was one of the reasons why they opted to move to Harlem. They had hoped that a new environment would give Johnson the opportunity to turn a new leaf and become a better person, but that wasn't the case. Johnson's early days in Harlem were made difficult by the fact that bullies constantly preyed on him. His bumpy head, thick Southern accent, and diminutive stature made him an easy target for local kids, who never hesitated to pounce on him when the opportunity presented itself. But little did they know that they were preparing him for a life in the criminal underworld. By the age of 15, Bumpy Johnson had become a notorious petty criminal, engaging in extortion and armed robbery. A few months later, his unruly behavior landed him at the Elmira Correctional Facility in New York. Borrowing from the influences of the various ethnic groups that dominated Harlem in the 20th century, Johnson evolved to become a brutal criminal boss with calculated moves. He unleashed terror when necessary and adopted diplomatic resolutions when needed. Johnson's career in the crime world began after he dropped out of school. Initially, he engaged in petty hustles in a bid to make ends meet. He would sell newspapers, hustle pools, and sweep the storefronts of small businesses with his friends. It was during this period that he encountered William "Bub" Hewlett, a brutal enforcer and leader of the notorious Bub Hewlett gang. Bub Hewlett was particularly fascinated by Johnson's courage when the teenager refused to back off from his storefront during a fierce confrontation. From that encounter, Bub knew that Johnson's courage would be very useful in the crime world, so he presented him with an offer to work as a bodyguard for elite numbers bankers in Harlem. Johnson accepted the offer and performed beyond expectation. In no time, he became famous as one of the best security guards in the neighborhood, but the lure of criminality was too much for him to ignore. In his early 20s, Bumpy Johnson spent most of his time in prison. In fact, many residents believed that the streets of Harlem were a tad safer anytime Johnson Johnson was in prison because whenever he was out, he terrorized everyone and anyone that dares to confront him. Ulysses Rollins, a notorious mob enforcer in Harlem, one of the few people that had the courage to square up against Bumpy Johnson, but he would live to regret it. On one occasion, both men clashed in a street fight with Johnson coming out on top. According to reports, by the end of this bloody encounter, Rollins went home with 36 different cuts delivered by Johnson's switchblade. On another occasion, both men ran into themselves in a dinner club. Johnson immediately charged at Rollins with a blade, and by the time they separated, one of Rollins's eyeballs was left dangling from its socket. In Johnson's biography, a spine-chilling description of the event that ensued after the fight reads, "Bumpy stood up and straightened his tie. Rollins remained on the floor, his face and body badly gashed, and one of his eyeballs hanging from the socket by ligaments. Bumpy calmly stepped over the man, picked up a menu, and said he suddenly had a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." This scene paints a mental picture of everything you need to know about the cruelty of the man named Bumpy Johnson. Johnson's impeccable switchblade skills stem from his days as a barber. Information from the archives of the 1940 census showed that a 41-year-old man named Ellsworth Johnson worked 72 hours as a barber in Harlem. The name and other details recovered from this archive matched perfectly with the profile of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's granddaughter, Margaret Johnson, also confirmed that he indeed worked as a barber in the early 1940s. "That's what he always said to people," Margaret said, "that he was a barber. He used to tell everyone he was a barber. I know he was good with a straight razor." The census record also showed that at that time, Bumpy Johnson earned an annual salary of over $1,000. But of course, with the benefit of hindsight now behind us, we know that he was earning way more than that, and his immediate and extensive family were the better for it. In Margaret's case, Bumpy Johnson spoiled her with all sorts of luxuries. She attended a private school and was driven around in a limousine. On top of that, Johnson threw lavish birthday parties for his granddaughter and would often fly out to Aqueduct or Belmont to bet on horses. And while other children had to work minor jobs to earn a small income, Margaret was getting paid fat salaries to calculate her grandfather's profits from illegal gambling. But despite his fierce reputation, Johnson's generosity reportedly extended beyond his family. He showed compassion towards the less privileged in his neighborhood, making financial donations and assisting in every way that he can. He paid rent for struggling families and put their children in school, among many other charitable projects that he funded. This made him a popular figure within Harlem. Describing Johnson's personality, Frank Lucas, a notorious drug lord that operated in Harlem between the 1960s and 1970s, said, "He wasn't a typical gangster," Lucas said. "He worked in the streets, but he wasn't of the streets. He was refined and classy, more like a businessman with a legitimate career than most people in the underworld. I could tell by looking at him that he was a lot different from the people I saw in the streets." Johnson's popularity was also boosted by his extravagant fashion sense and lavish lifestyle, which saw him hang out like celebrities like Billie Holiday and Sugar Ray Robinson. But that didn't stop him from engaging in criminality. Bumpy and Stephanie Sinclair. Having served a 30-month jail term for a grand larceny charge, Bumpy Johnson returned to the streets with no fortune to turn to and no viable occupation. His frustration at the time led him to meet Stephanie St. Clair, who immediately hired him as chief enforcer. Stephanie St. Clair was a notorious Harlem mob boss nicknamed the Queen of Numbers. Born to a single mother on the 24th of December, 1897, Stephanie St. Clair was not your regular mobster. Growing up, her mother worked extremely hard to put her through school, but disaster struck during her teenage years. At the age of 15, Stephanie's mom was knocked down by a serious illness that eventually took her life, and St. Clair was left to navigate the trials of life alone. This was a huge test for a girl in her teenage years, but Stephanie had enough resolve to pull through. Following the death of her mother, she saved up a bit so she could migrate from the West Indies to Montreal in Canada. Upon arriving in Canada, she worked as a housekeeper for a family before moving to the U.S. in 1912. Ironically, her first point of call in the United States was Harlem, and it was there she met a man named Duke, whom she fell in love with. Duke was also reportedly in love with her. However, he attempted to sex traffic her. History doesn't exactly say if Stephanie was cool with the idea or not, but her escapade with Duke was short-lived, as he was shot dead in a notorious gang war. By then, Stephanie St. Clair had settled well into Harlem culture. Her sound educational background also gave her an edge because she could express herself fluently in both French and English, and having developed a strong personality at a young age, it was only a matter of time before she started to lend her voice to the fight against racism and other societal issues that plagued the black community. But while she fought against racial injustice, Stephanie Sinclair also engaged in several illicit businesses, albeit with the help of her newfound love named Ed. Within a few years, the couple made $30,000 from their drug peddling scheme alone. However, Stephanie would soon decide that she wants out. Expectedly, her decision to pull out angered Ed, who tried to strangle her to death. Unfortunately for him, he met his match. Stephanie resisted him, and in the course of the scuffle, she smashed his head on a wall, and he died in the process. Stephanie wasted no time in moving on with her life. She invested $10,000 in a numbers racket game called Policy Banking. The business blossomed and provided employment for several black Harlem residents as cooks, chauffeurs, and even property managers. With time, Stephanie also incorporated illegal activities into her business, ranging from gambling to lottery. Many people saw the business as an investment platform, and as a result, it pulled in hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. By 1930, Stephanie's personal fortune was estimated to be around $500,000, which is equivalent to $8 million in today's economy. This astonishing valuation excludes the several properties she owned within the Harlem neighborhood. As her empire continued to grow, Stephanie Sinclair became a hugely influential figure. She had several law enforcement officers on her payroll, and this helped her compromise the system. But following the end of the Prohibition era in 1933, the traditional Jewish and Italian crime families became frustrated at their dwindling income. So they moved into Harlem in an attempt to take over the numbers game business. Backed by his robust connection with the political class and law enforcement agencies, Dutch Schultz, a notorious crime boss, led the takeover charge. At the time, Schultz was primarily based in the northern part of New York City and was unarguably one of the most prominent mobsters around. His bootlegging enterprise was worth around $2 million, which translates to around $35 million in today's money. But he also wanted a share of the $50 million annual turnover generated by the numbers racket businesses in Harlem. In the early days of the incursion, Schultz sent word across town, offering the owners of the numbers racket centers two options. They could either relinquish their authority and work for him or lose their business altogether. It was a difficult decision, but after evaluating their chances, most of these business owners knew they couldn't go head-to-head with Dutch Schultz, so they bowed to pressure and shook hands with him on the deal. In return, Schultz paid each of them a basic salary of $200 weekly. But while these men fell in the face of oppression, the only female numbers runner in Harlem, Stephanie Sinclair, and her chief enforcer Bumpy Johnson refused to back down. Only 26 at the time, Johnson had a small but gallant squad, and he led them to war against one of the most established criminal gangs of that era. Johnson's personal beef with the whites from his childhood also served as extra motivation in his fight against Dutch Schultz and his men. In a later interview about the fight, Bumpy's wife, Mamie Johnson, said her husband and his crew of 9 waged a guerrilla war against Dutch Schultz and his men. Of course, Schultz had the bigger squad, but most of them were white, and it was quite easy to pick them out in the predominantly black community of Harlem. So, while Bumpy's squad were able to disguise and operate undercover, Schultz's men were incredibly exposed. Over the course of the next 3 years, more than 40 people had been killed or kidnapped in the gang war. Despite the superior firepower of Schultz and his crew, they couldn't seem to squash Stephanie's empire, and this was all thanks to the resolve of Bumpy Johnson and his courageous men. But something had to give at some point. Interestingly, it was Schultz who gave way first. The notorious crime boss was murdered by gunmen in October 1935. Naturally, many people would have thought Stephanie Sinclair and Bumpy Johnson were responsible for his death, but that wasn't the case. You see, as the fight against Johnson's gang was going on, Schultz was also being investigated by the feds for multiple tax evasion cases, and once he realized he was about to be convicted, he decided to take out Thomas Dewey, the prosecuting attorney in charge of trial. But first, he needed to seek permission from Lucky Luciano, the boss of the Italian crime family in New York. Luciano turned down the request, fearing that it could lead to a significant reprisal attack by the authorities. However, Schultz was desperate to avoid going to prison, so he decided to go ahead with his plan. Unfortunately, Luciano got wind of Schultz's disobedience and sanctioned his assassination. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was shot just below the heart while using the bathroom at Newark's Palace Chop House restaurant. The injury was quite severe, but Schultz would live for another 22 hours before he gave up the ghost. But even on his deathbed, Schultz still managed to stir up drama. The crime boss reportedly gave his doctor $10,000 to cover the cost of treatment. Terrified by his antecedent of the mobster, the doctor turned down the generous payment. In the final moments of his existence, Schultz received a chilling message from Stephanie Sinclair saying, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Perhaps in response, Schultz muttered the words, "A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kin. You can play jacks, and girls do that with a softball and do tricks with it. Oh, dog biscuit, and when he is happy, he doesn't get snappy." Bumpy and Lucky Luciano. Following Schultz's death, Bumpy Johnson brokered a deal with Lucky Luciano, which allowed the Harlem lottery houses to maintain their independence while remitting a portion of their profits to the Italian crime boss. It wasn't the perfect solution, especially because Johnson was known to hate the whites, but considering the size of the opponent he was up against in Charles Lucky Luciano, it was a fair deal. Nicknamed the godfather of organized crime in the United States, Luciano was born on the 24th of November 1897 in Sicily in Italy. 10 years after his birth, the lofty ambition of Luciano's dad, Antonio Lucania, meant that the family had to relocate from Lercara Fritti in Sicily to the Lower East Side in Manhattan, New York City. At the time, this area had become a famous destination among Italian families seeking greener pastures in the United States. And while many families found the greener pastures they were looking for, it came at a very costly price. Back then, New York City was seen as an economic hub where Italian families could make some extra legitimate dollars. However, it was also the epidemic headquarters of crime in the country at the time. So as parents worked hard to put food on the table, the many bad influences on the streets of Manhattan meant their children were constantly being recruited into criminal gangs. In the case of Luciano, he first quit school at the age of 14 to work as a hat delivery boy. At $7 per week, his take-home from this legitimate hustle wasn't exactly the best. Nevertheless, one would have thought it was just about enough to keep a young boy like Lucky Luciano satisfied, but that wasn't the case. After winning a life-changing $244 in a dice game in the street, Luciano decided it was time to quit his hat delivery job. He reckoned there were much easier ways to make money on the streets of New York. Although he was only still a teenager, Luciano had the guts of a hardened adult criminal. By his early teenage years, he had already started to engage in petty crimes like extortion, muggings, and stealing. As if this wasn't bad enough, Luciano officially joined the notorious 5 Points gang, and within a few months he upgraded his petty criminal status and began to deal and smoke heroin. But beyond his love for criminality, Luciano had a keen interest in the game of money. As a matter of fact, money was the main factor that lured him into criminality, and the biggest motivation behind his actions and inactions. After a short stint in prison for pushing heroin, Luciano was hired by a street boss in Manhattan named Joe Masseria in 1920. A few years later, he had grown to become Masseria's right hand and handled the day-to-day operations of the business on behalf of his boss. Business was booming, which ultimately meant life was good and to some extent peaceful for Lucky Luciano. But everything changed during the brutal gang war in the early 1930s. A significant dispute saw Masseria declare war on a rival crime called Salvatore Maranzano. Expectedly, Luciano and other foot soldiers of Masseria's crime family joined in the fight as well, but they weren't exactly excited by the turn of events, especially because it attracted unnecessary attention to them, and more importantly, it resulted in the loss of profits. So Luciano stepped in to resolve the issue himself. The first step of his resolution plan was to lay an ambush for his boss. This happened on the 15th of April, 1931. He invited Joe Masseria to dinner at a restaurant in Coney Island. While both men were eating, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. As Joe Masseria continued the meal, 4 of Luciano's most trusted loyalists walked in and assassinated him. The hit squad included Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. 5 months later, Luciano hired 4 Jewish gunmen to kill Salvatore Maranzano. This move successfully ended the war between the two gangs, meaning that Luciano and other young racketeers could finally go back to living their normal lives. Thanks to his impeccable courage and influence across the crime underworld, Luciano was seen as the heir to the throne left behind by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. And although he never officially accepted the title, most people in the Mafia family regarded him as the boss of all bosses. In the years following the death of his former boss, Luciano began to rethink the modus operandi of the business. He knew well enough that violence was a major contributing factor to the success of a Mafia family. However, he also believed that he could run the business efficiently without necessarily shedding blood. So he called for a meeting of the American-Italian crime bosses in Chicago. According to reports, 4 of the most prominent criminal gang leaders in New York and the legendary Al Capone were all in attendance. In this first-of-its-kind meeting, Luciano divided the regional crime groups into 5 Mafia families. Each family was expected to operate under the command of the regional boss and within the confines of a uniform honor corps called Omerta. This new structure allowed each Mafia family to operate independently while upholding the interest of the center. More importantly, it helped to prevent violent clashes clashes among the families. Following this meeting, the Mafia experienced a significant period of peace and stability. It was around this time that Luciano approved the independence of the lottery houses in Harlem. But of course, he controlled the region by proxy through Bumpy Johnson. But karma was slowly catching up with both men. By 1935, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had gathered enough evidence of Luciano's illicit prostitution rackets and extortion activities. And 1 year later, the crime boss was found guilty on 63 counts and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. However, he continued to oversee the activities of the Mafia family, even behind bars, until he was pardoned and deported to Italy in 1946. At about the same time, things were changing very quickly in the Harlem crime industry. Stephanie Sinclair had decided it was time to quit, so she handed over her empire to Bumpy Johnson. Under Johnson, the business evolved from a numbers racket and extortion enterprise to become a full-blown criminal organization dealing in narcotics, prostitution, gambling, and protection rackets. Alcatraz and Malcolm X. Bumpy Johnson successfully dominated the Harlem crime community for many years until he was arrested in 1951. Based on the evidence presented against him, Johnson was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. For most of his sentence, Johnson was held at the maximum security Alcatraz prison on the coast of California. Nicknamed The Rock, this facility is regarded as one of the most secure prison facilities in America and the world at large. In fact, at the time, being held at Alcatraz was regarded as the worst possible punishment a criminal can get. And it's not just because of the stern faces of the guards or the numerous solitary confinement treatment that most inmates at the facility are subjected to. In its heyday, the Alcatraz prison had the capacity to house between 300 and 450 inmates, but trusted sources claim that the facility never housed more than 250 prisoners at one time. Aside from Bumpy Johnson, other notorious criminals like Al Capone, George Kelly, and Robert Stroud also spent time in this hostile environment at different points of their criminal life. You see, the facility itself is located on a lonely island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, meaning anyone that is unlucky enough to be held there is completely cut out from the outside world. On top of that, the island on which the prison is built is surrounded by treacherous water, featuring strong currents and temperatures of around 16 degrees Celsius. So, in other words, the Alcatraz prison was more or less an escape-proof jailhouse, but of course a few courageous offenders have tried to abscond the facility. Overall, a total of 36 men tried 14 different attempts to escape Alcatraz. Many of them were either caught or killed during the attempt, and it is believed that the ones who successfully evaded the attention of the guards most likely didn't make it to the shore. However, in May 1946, chaos broke out at the facility when a group of inmates overpowered prison guards, seizing firearms and keys. Consequently, they engaged in a fierce gun battle against the guards. 3 escapees and 2 security guards were killed in the exchange, and had the U.S. Marines not intervened, the situation could have escalated even further. Fast forward to June 1962, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence mysteriously disappeared from their cell room in the facility. Investigators would later find multiple cues that revealed their escape plans, which was reportedly drafted and perfected across 6 months. They expanded the ventilation ducts using makeshift drills and other household tools. Then they built a 6 by 14-foot makeshift boat from 50 raincoats. After 17 years of investigation, the FBI couldn't find credible evidence that any of these men made it out of island alive. Unconfirmed reports suggest that Bumpy Johnson was involved in this audacious escape mission. However, his wife claimed that he opted not to join the escapees because he'd rather be a free man than a fugitive. Following the completion of his prison sentence, Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem to meet a different society from the one he left behind. Drug trading had become the order of the day, and the Mafia families had even more influence than they did when Johnson was godfather. Despite being one of the pioneers of illegal schemes in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson decided to turn a new leaf and began advocating for the civil rights of Black Americans in the community. It was during this period that he ran into Malcolm X, an old-time friend, a powerful community leader, and civil rights activist. In the early days of his advocacy career, Malcolm X was part of a Chicago-based Black Muslim movement led by Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm was one of the most vocal voices within the organization. He traveled across America and several countries in America, delivering inspirational lectures. Malcolm's exceptional level of intelligence and articulation earned him the admonition of prominent people. At some point, the civil rights activists shared a close relationship with the great Muhammad Ali. However, his growing influence soon made him a real threat to the position of Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who at the time was his leader and mentor. The breaking point between both men came in November 1963 after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Following the incident, Elijah Muhammad ordered his followers to steer clear of the issue. As a matter of fact, he restricted them from talking about it. But Malcolm X flouted this rule when he described the president's assassination as the devil's chickens coming home to roost.
Not your neighbor's barnyard.
I think this is a prime example of the devil's chickens coming back home to roost.
Honorable Elijah Muhammad responded by suspending Malcolm X for 90 days, but this didn't seem to change anything. Few months after his suspension was announced, Malcolm X reiterated his views again in an interview with journalists.
Hey, but only I said the chickens came home to roost, and which means the same thing. Climate of hate means that this is the result of something. And when I said chickens coming home to roost, I said the same thing.
But you did not say that you were glad the president was killed.
No, that's what the press said. What would I look like saying that I'm glad the president was killed?
This statement infuriated Elijah Muhammad and his followers even more, and it was only a matter of time before Malcolm X began to receive death threats.
Still wouldn't know what really took place.
Why are they threatening your life?
Well, primarily because they're afraid that I will tell the real reason that I'm out of the black Muslim movement, which I never told. I kept to myself.
When journalists pressed further, Malcolm X didn't hesitate to drop the bombshell.
But the real reason is that Elijah Muhammad, the head of the movement, is the father of 8 children by 6 different teenage girls. 6 different teenage girls who were his private personal secretary.
Malcolm X was well aware that he had burnt the bridge between himself and Honorable Elijah Muhammad, so he knew exactly what to expect. But even in the face of intimidation and death threats, he showed no fear.
No, I don't worry. I tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
However, to be on the safe side, he hired Bumpy Johnson as his personal bodyguard. With the help of Johnson and his gang, who took care of the security side of things, Malcolm X was able to continue his life as an activist. But after a while, he decided that his relationship with a notorious criminal like Johnson was bad for the optics, so he discharged the Harlem Godfather of his duties. This left Malcolm X open to attacks from extremists, and he was eventually assassinated a few weeks later on the 21st of February, 1965. 3 years later, Johnson would meet his own dead end, but under different circumstances. The former crime boss was eating his favorite meal, chicken, legs, and hominy grits at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, when he suddenly clutched his chest and fell to the ground. A few minutes later, he took his last breath. Autopsy reports showed that Johnson died of congestive heart failure. This was quite a surprise because, considering the type of life he lived, not too many people would have expected Bumpy Johnson to die a natural death. Thanks for watching this video to the end. If you've enjoyed it, click on any of the cards on the screen to watch more exciting videos like this one.